Okay, welcome to lesson 29. I'm calling this program Process Array. And let's see what it looks like here. Let me reload it. So we enter some comma separated numbers. And then we can push the sum button. There's the sum. And there's the max. Okay, so this is good practice for coding. It's going to take some mind power, but it is interesting and it is good practice. It's also a very good program for someone who's interested in kind of processing numbers. Let's say someone who's interested in statistics, because this is the beginning, simplified, but this is the beginning of what could be a cool number processing program for statistics or other purposes. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Excuse me. Copy this. I left out CSS because I wanted, it's going to become a lot of code, so I wanted to simplify it. So I left out the CSS. You can put that in later and make it look really good. But copy this down. We have a little bit of HTML, a couple buttons, and then a little bit of JavaScript. The functions are blank, and this is just to let us know that we will be writing these functions. So copy that down, and when we return, we will start writing the convert to num array function. Okay, so we're going to write this first function. Okay, so let me tell you why we're writing this function, the convert to num array. That is because we have this input up here, array input, but that's text input. So when the user puts numbers in there, comma separated numbers, they're automatically text, and we have to convert that text into numbers in order to process the numbers. So that's why we're writing this function called convert to num array. Okay, so the first line is let text array equal array input, and you have to spell that right, dot value dot split the comma in there. Now I'm going to go ahead and build the whole function, and then I'll explain everything in the function. So console log let num array equal empty array. That means we're creating a new array that's empty. We're going to fill it. Now we're doing a for loop through the text array. And if the for loop looks a little confusing, go back to early lessons on loops. And don't worry, I'll explain this push stuff. I'll explain this whole function in a second. Okay, so I want to test this function we just wrote. So I'm going to go up here and put some numbers in here. And if I hit enter, you'll notice that on console log, we got an array of the same array we inputted. And notice, very importantly, that there are quotes around each of the numbers in that array. So what that is telling us is that is an array of text. I mean, it looks like numbers, but they're in quotes, so that's text. And we need to convert that into a number array. So another thing we can do here, after the for loop, let's console log num array. Let's reload this. Put in a couple numbers. I'm going to hit enter. And notice the difference. So the first gave us the text array. And then we said console log the num array. Excuse me for moving that. And notice there's no quotes and they're in blue. Those are numbers. So we successfully converted a text array into a number array. And now that will allow us to process those numbers. Okay? So I'm going to write this console log. These are just tests. We can actually get rid of those. We just use them. We are just using them for testing purposes. So maximum. Let's write the maximum function. I'm declaring a new array called the array. You can call it whatever you want, but probably should stick with my names until you... by the way, I'm going to go ahead and write this whole function and then I'll explain what's going on. Let max equal a number negative 10,000. And you might notice that in my for loops I use I all the time. That's kind of a convention to use I. Don't need to. And again, I will explain this, so don't worry about it, just get it down. And you could wait till I write it and then pause it and write it, however you want to do it. Okay, before I explain it, I want to test it. So let's reload it. Put 3 numbers in. And this is the max. And it worked. You can see it pulled out the maximum number. It figured out what the maximum number is and put it into an output. Okay, so let's go over that function. So I just declared a new variable called the array. It could be anything you want. And look what I did there. I called the convert to number array. So I'm asking for the number array that we created in this conversion function because I want to work with numbers. So this conversion function up here kind of is a little utility that is helping us convert text to numbers so we can process them. Okay, so I need to get the number array before I do anything else. So that's what I'm doing in this first line. And you notice in the conversion function that it says return number array. That means when I call this function, it will automatically insert that number array into this area here and assign it to the array. That's what return is about. I hope I went over that. Anyway, then we declare a new variable called max, and it's a very, very low number. I mean, it could be lower, of course. It could be negative 1 million or whatever. Because we want the first number we check to be higher than that. And we don't know. If you had an array, if you knew your array is going to have a lot of, if you knew your array was going to have a lot of negative numbers and a lot of big negative numbers, you might want to have an even greater negative number here, like a negative 1 million or whatever. Just depends on the numbers you're inputting. So what we're doing is we're testing. We enter into a for loop. We're going to run through every element in the array, our number array, and we're going to test it. We're going to say if, let's say I is 0. If the array is 0, and the first number we put in was 34, if 34 is greater than max, and remember max is a very low number, so it's probably going to be greater, then take that number, 34, and assign it to max. So what we're saying there is, since that number is greater than max, it is the new max. It's the maximum. And we do that for every element in the array. So if we find a number that's greater than 34, that becomes the new maximum. Okay? And then we just, when we're done with that for loop, when we process every number in the array, that means we're done with the for loop, we should have a maximum number in that array. And then we just assign that to the text of the output, or little HTML output. And that's what we got. Okay, so let me pause this, make sure you have this down, make sure it's working. And then when we come back, I'm going to show you the code for the sum function. Okay, so this is the sum function. Go ahead and copy that. So pause this and copy that, and I will explain what the sum function is doing. Okay, in the sum function, we declare a new variable called the array. And by the way, this is not getting confused with the previous the array in the maximum function, because since it's in a different function, it doesn't matter. It's not, the program will not be confused because it's that variable is isolated in that function. So again, we grab the converted array and we set the sum to 0 because we're about ready to sum some numbers, but currently the sum is 0. We start off with 0. And then we go through the entire array, and all we're doing is adding each element to the sum. So on the first one, let's say the array 0, which was 34, the sum, we add that to the sum. So now the sum is 34, and then when we get to the second one, I think it was 89, and so we're adding that to the sum. So we keep building the sum up, as we go through each element in the number array. And then once we're done with that for loop, we have the sum of all the numbers in the array, and then we output that. Okay, so one thing I didn't explain was the convert to num array, which is actually the hardest function in here. So let me explain that. We start off by declaring text array, because remember, the user is putting in some numbers and those are interpreted as text because it's basically a text input. So we just call it text array. Now this might look confusing to you. Array input, that is that little text box, so that's not confusing. The value is basically all the stuff that's in that text box. What's the value of the stuff in the text box? In this case, what's the value of the text in the text box? And then we have a little split function or method, split method, which takes each item and it says, okay, we're separating by commas here. So it takes each item that's separated by a comma and split it into separate little elements. And that's why when we console logged the text array, we saw each element was in quotes, and then there was a comma, and the next element was in quotes. Okay, so you haven't seen split before, so I would, after you're done here, do a search Javascript split and see what comes up, and play with split just to see how it works, get a good feel for how it works. Okay, so here we declare an empty, basically a new array that's empty, because we're going to build the array. And then we go through each item in the text array. And let's start over here. A lot of times you start from the right and you work to the left. So what we're saying here is take each item in the text array, parse float. That means take that text, turn it into a floating point number. Now, why am I using floating point instead of integer? It's just because we don't know. Someone might enter floating points or decimal numbers. So we don't know if they're going to enter integers or floating point numbers. So this could be parse int, but it won't be able to process floating point numbers. So we're taking the text, we are pulling the number out of that text. So in other words, if it's in quotes, we get rid of the quotes and make it a number. That's what that does. And push just means we're taking that array, and whatever this number is, we are pushing it onto the array. In other words, we're adding it onto the array. That's what push means, adding it onto the array. Okay, and then when we're done with that for loop, we should have a number array that has a bunch of numbers in it. And so all I'm saying here is return that number array whenever we call this conversion program or conversion function. Okay, so I know that's a lot of brain power that goes into understanding that. I totally get it. But if you study this, you will have learned a lot and your progress will be great. And like I said, this is the beginning of a cool number processing program for someone who loves statistics. And if you don't, it's still a very good learning experience. Okay, so thanks for joining me, and see you in lesson 30.